Dreams. Why they are so strange. First, let me state. It is generally assumed, without reflection, that we perceive the world with our consciousness and then make decisions based on it. We don't understand the sequence of events in our dreams, which we interpret as reality while asleep, when we are awake. This is because we consider the external world we see to be a fixed reality. Only when we realize that our brain, more precisely, the neural networks, first shows us the world and then immediately processes sensory information from the external world, if it differs from our stored perception, does it become clear that the world is not a fixed reality, but can only ever be seen from one perspective. For dreams, this means, since we perceive the world through our brain while awake and interpret it as reality, we do the same with our dreams while asleep. This clarifies several questions. Why do we perceive the world this way? Science knows that we select it. According to which directives? According to our goals. Where are these goals located? In the brain, and not in consciousness. It follows that we don't see the world as it actually is, but as it best serves us from the brain's perspective. Now, the world is constantly changing. This raises the question, how do we acquire new information? Through the senses. Consciousness perceives the world through the senses and sends it to the brain. The brain can then change its objectives. As a result, we see the world differently. Consciousness is heightened perception through the senses, sensory perception, nothing more. It receives information from both the outside world and the inner world. When we sleep, we generally only receive information from within, except for a few external stimuli that overcome the now higher thresholds, which it sends to the brain as usual. During sleep, the brain functions differently because it lacks the capabilities of the frontal lobe, including its logical processing. Furthermore, various neural connections change. This means that the cerebral cortex, which is responsible, among other things, for the logical processing of events, loses this function during sleep. As a result, bizarre impressions, for example, appear real. And since it now receives different information, different themes emerge through which it perceives the world. Answer: during sleep, the brain presents us with a world that we interpret as reality through our senses, which we receive from within. The fact that dreams are so incomprehensible after we wake up is explained by our now unrestricted perception of the outside world, including the frontal lobe. The senses can once again take in all the information that the brain's processes allow. From this perspective, the events in the dream no longer make sense. The dream world and the world we see with a fully functioning brain are therefore very different and, as mentioned, generate what the senses send to the brain, and what we then perceive. Understanding these perceptions is difficult for people who continue to live from the perspective of their familiar world. But even experts have seemingly insurmountable, especially emotional, problems accepting that consciousness doesn't execute and decide everything, but rather the brain does. Thus, the perception of our dreams, which we grasp as absolute reality, remains an unsolvable puzzle for them. In dreams, emotions hold sway. The intellect is largely switched off. Any thought, upon returning to waking consciousness, that the metaphysical played a role is merely wishful thinking. Unlike waking life, where goals of adaptation dominate with the cerebrum, dreams deal with themes specific to the individual being, which can no longer be influenced to the same extent by the cerebrum, but rather by feelings. Here, the cerebrum plays a less significant role, as it is largely deactivated. Thus, the fantasies of dreams are perceived as reality. Sleep is about recovery from waking life, during which one can constantly be brought back into structure by the cerebrum. Dreams are about the continued activity of the senses, which are now directed inward. Since several brain functions are deactivated, they reveal themes and processes that are not geared toward a final outcome, like goals. Although even here, only substances operate according to laws. Therefore, one shouldn't take one's dreams too seriously. They are surreal stimuli, scenes, or stories that arise through associations, similarities, and so on. Overall, however, they have little to do with reality. This can be seen, for example, in daydreams that are triggered by certain impulses or similarities and generate fantasies. Of course, one wouldn't consider these reality either. Certainly, these can also include one's own wishes, fears, desires, anxieties, etc., that have been stimulated. It is not uncommon for these to be emotions that are somehow aroused and, through vivid fantasies, are experienced unchecked as reality. Although dreams, like everything else, arise from substances that operate according to laws, they are hardly useful in life as a prophet because everything is thrown into disarray and realities play no role. This is mostly due to the similarities that are no longer monitored, for example, by the midpoints, especially in which the frontal lobe plays a significant role. Whether we are awake or asleep, our brain is always working. It takes in information from the external and internal worlds through the senses. When awake, it primarily takes in information from the external world so that we can adapt. This changes and adjusts the goals in the brain, and naturally, simultaneously, the midpoints that carries them out. When awake, the midpoints often filters out what doesn't fit its goals, including fantasies, illogical things, and dreams. Through this mechanism, it is then no longer perceived by the senses. When asleep, it takes in information from the internal world, because that is precisely the function of the senses. Here, goals and their midpoints are not active, partly because, as mentioned, they would disrupt recovery during sleep. The brain is therefore not governed by these midpoints, but rather by themes that create a colorful jumble of whatever is currently being stimulated. Thus, the brain functions similarly in dreams and waking life. The only difference is that in waking life, the midpoints take the lead, guiding the entire process. And during sleep, brain functions are restricted. In both cases, we experience the world, and it appears real to us. Goals are oriented toward a final state. Themes are not, they are open-ended. Of course, all themes can become goals in waking life, if they have crossed certain thresholds, and then actively play a role in the psyche. To reiterate, in dreams, the brain shows us how, unregulated by the midpoint of waking life, it functions internally, partly due to the restriction of the frontal lobe and striated muscles during sleep. This is why dreams are often so incomprehensible, see above. They show us a world limited by our senses in relation to reality. Because certain functions are deactivated during sleep, issues can surface that are not perceived while awake. Goals can also play a role here, that are no longer excluded from midpoints because there is often no space for them. This can also include fantasies that came to mind while awake but were dismissed as irrelevant or nonsensical, yet were still stored. Of course, problems, conflicts, desires, etc., are also triggered in dreams and then processed. The results are usually fantasies, unrealistic solutions, or not, as is the case with traumatic experiences whose causes can be triggered during sleep and lead to nightmares. Thus, it can show the most bizarre stories and images, which we take as absolute reality, until we are awake again and our everyday cognitive behavior, including the functions of the frontal lobe, has resumed. We are accustomed to living purposefully, to steering everything in a comprehensible direction. Answer: dreams are interpreted accordingly. They are ascribed an inherent coherence, which is certainly incorrect. Dreaming during sleep merely shows us how the brain functions without the goals of waking life. It generally does not depict how we should act, because it has only limited functions. And it certainly does not show us how the metaphysical, a god, or the supernatural wants to motivate us to do something. One should always keep in mind that the brain, like everything else, consists of substances that function according to laws. Question: why didn't people in the past come up with the idea that dreams are produced solely by their brains? Answer: because they didn't know how the brain works and that dreams are solely shaped by it. And they clung to their belief in metaphysical activity because they couldn't explain it any other way. It's always the same. When something isn't clear, interpretations, explanations, and fantasies come into play. These fill the knowledge gap. Answer: people have often sought the origin of their dreams externally, for example, divinely or otherwise mystical instructions. If you ask yourself what dreams are meant to show us, the answer is, they tell us little of practical use. Because that's not their purpose. However, by reflecting on your interpretation of dreams while awake, you could learn something about yourself, what goals and themes, among other things, unconsciously shape us. This also means understanding what your psyche is currently unconsciously preoccupied with. In conclusion, we sleep because it allows us to recover from our waking state. We dream because our senses remain more or less active at all times, if only to be able to perceive dangers from the environment. Appendix: Artificial Intelligence, AI, my inquiry of February 1, 2026. On this topic, here is a description of how the frontal lobe, that is, the prefrontal cortex, behaves during sleep and how much it differs from the waking state. The frontal lobe is the part of our brain responsible for planning, self-control, decision-making, and rational thinking. 1. The frontal lobe while awake. The prefrontal cortex is highly active. It evaluates situations, makes decisions, and controls impulses. It helps us to think logically, solve problems, and control our behavior. In short, it is our inner manager. 2. What happens during sleep? As soon as we fall asleep, the activity in the frontal lobe changes significantly. During light and deep sleep, the activity of the frontal lobe decreases sharply. The body focuses on recovery, repair processes, and conserving energy. The frontal lobe switches down, rational thinking plays almost no role. During REM sleep, dream sleep, the frontal lobe is particularly subdued. This is precisely why dreams often seem illogical, chaotic, or emotionally exaggerated. The control mechanism is absent. The brain allows associations to flow more freely. 3. Why is this important? The reduced activity of the frontal lobe enables emotional processing. Memories are sorted, integrated, and sometimes re-evaluated. Creative connections arise more easily because the logical break is absent. At the same time, sleep protects us from constantly analyzing rationally. That would be far too energy-intensive. 4. Summary. Awake, frontal lobe active, control, logic, planning. Sleep, frontal lobe subdued, emotions, dreams, processing. REM sleep, frontal lobe almost switched off, creative, often bizarre dream worlds.